I bought the house for the land. An acre and a half of flat, open space with a gravel driveway that curved like a lazy river around a cluster of old pine trees. The house itself was modest, 2 stories, red brick, white trim, but it was mine. Paid for with years of landscaping work, sunburns, and backaches. Out here, on the edge of Willow Creek, I thought I'd found peace. Then came the Homeowners Association. It started quietly. A flyer in the mailbox about a proposed community governance committee. Then a meeting. Then a vote. By the time I blinked, Willow Creek had an HOA, and with it, a president named Marjorie Pickens. Marjorie was the type who never left her house without her lipstick perfect and her hair iron flat. She once tried to fine a neighbor for planting wildflowers too close to the sidewalk. She had a clipboard, a Bluetooth headset, and a permanent frown carved into her face like it was set in granite. And, unfortunately for me, she also had a vendetta. She didn't like my tractor. It wasn't parked in the front. I kept it behind the shed, covered when not in use. It was clean, quiet, and crucial to my business. I ran a small but steady landscaping company. No loud crews. No heavy traffic. Just me, my machine, and a few loyal clients outside the neighborhood. Still, she called it an eyesore. Her first letter came polite, thinly veiled in neighborly concern. Dear Mr. Jensen, we've received several complaints regarding the industrial equipment stored on your property. In accordance with HOA guidelines regarding visual harmony and property standards, please remove the tractor within 10 business days to avoid fines. I read it twice. Then I walked out back and stared at the tarp-covered machine like it had betrayed me. It hadn't moved in a week. I replied in writing, citing the property plat, zoning allowances, and HOA bylaw 3.7b. Nothing prohibited utility equipment used for maintaining one's own land. Her second letter ignored all that. Failure to comply will result in action taken by the board. 3 days later, I came home from a job to find 3 concrete barriers planted at the mouth of my driveway. Thick, gray slabs, each the size of a coffin, and just as welcoming. A laminated sign had been zip-tied to a lawn stake in front of them. Access to this driveway has been suspended due to ongoing HOA noncompliance. Please contact the board for resolution. I stood in the road, blinking against the sun, wondering if I'd fallen into some surreal parody of suburban life. Who blocks a man from his own home? I pulled my truck onto the grass, parked beside the mailbox, and walked the length of the driveway in silence. The concrete barriers weren't decorative. They were reinforced, industrial grade, the kind used to reroute highway traffic. My wife opened the door before I reached the porch. They did it, she said, voice tight with anger. They actually did it. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just stared at the sign, then at the barriers, then back at my gravel driveway, mine legally and practically, and something cold settled in my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Just the awareness that this was no longer about rules. This was about control. And someone had decided I needed to be reminded of who held the reins. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room, lights off, sipping black coffee, while the shadows of the barriers loomed through the blinds like silent sentinels. My wife eventually went to bed. I didn't move, because I was already planning. They wanted a fight on paper. Petitions and citations. A bureaucratic strangling. But they'd forgotten one thing. I owned a tractor. The next morning, I went outside with a purpose. The sun had barely broken over the horizon, and the concrete barriers still sat in the middle of my driveway like defiant monuments to petty authority. But today, they were going to move. I didn't waste time calling anyone. No lawyer. No city official. They had crossed a line, and I wasn't about to stand around waiting for the paperwork to catch up with the injustice. I walked to the back of the house, through the gate, and into the shed where my tractor waited. The John Deere 4066R was parked exactly as I'd left it, quiet, covered, ready for work. The engine purred to life with the first turn of the key, the vibrations coursing through my hands like an electric charge. It felt good to be in control. To know that I had the means, the power, and the resolve to take back what was mine. I drove around the back of the house, careful to keep the machine hidden from the street, and then I turned the corner of the front yard. The driveway loomed ahead, blocked by the 3 concrete barriers like some twisted game of Red Rover. I smiled grimly. As I approached, the weight of the machine settled comfortably into my chest. I'd used this tractor for years. To till soil, to move heavy stone, to haul loads of mulch and gravel. It was my livelihood, my tool. But today it was going to be a message. I eased the front loader under the first barrier, positioning the large metal forks so that they slipped just beneath the massive slab of concrete. The machine hummed with quiet strength as I slowly lifted the barrier off the ground. It felt heavier than I expected, but the tractor was built for this. I backed up, inching the weight carefully toward the street. The tires of the tractor churned against the gravel, sending small clouds of dust into the air as I made my way down the lane. I kept my speed slow and steady, focusing on the road ahead. This was no longer a matter of convenience. This was about reasserting my right to my property, my space. By the time I reached the end of the street, the neighbors were watching. One by one, heads popped out from behind curtains and windows slid open. I didn't care. I wasn't doing this for an audience. This wasn't a stunt. It was justice. Pure and simple. I pulled up to the HOA clubhouse, a sterile building that always felt too shiny for its own good. The white walls glowed under the morning sun, the landscaping manicured to within an inch of its life. It was a house of rules and control, designed for one purpose: to remind people like me that we were only guests in our own homes. I lifted the first barrier over the sidewalk and set it down gently in front of the door. I didn't knock. I didn't ask for permission. I just moved it, one piece at a time. The sound of concrete scraping across asphalt echoed down the street. People began to gather. There was Doug from 2 houses down, holding his phone out as he recorded the spectacle. Lisa, the HOA secretary, poked her head out from behind a tree, her eyes wide with confusion. They had no idea what to do with me. No idea how to handle someone who wasn't afraid of their rules. I moved to the second barrier. Marjorie's precious clubhouse wasn't getting off easy. She'd made a decision to block me from my own home, and now I was returning the favor. It didn't take long to unload the second and third barriers, each one carefully placed in front of the clubhouse. The heavy slabs formed a line, an undeniable statement of defiance. By the time I finished, I turned around to see the rest of the neighborhood standing at the edges of their lawns, watching. Marjorie's Lexus was parked in front of the clubhouse, but there was no sign of her. I could hear the distant sound of footsteps approaching, the rustle of gravel under heels. Marjorie finally appeared, storming up the sidewalk, her red lipstick gleaming like a warning. Her face twisted in disbelief as she took in the scene. "What do you think you're doing?" she yelled, hands thrown up in the air, her voice cracking with indignation. "You can't just block the HOA. This is vandalism." I stayed in the tractor, my hands firmly on the wheel. "I'm returning what you put in my way," I said, my voice calm, controlled. "You wanted to block my driveway. Now I'm blocking yours." She stepped forward, fists clenched, eyes blazing with fury. "You'll pay for this. I'll have you fined, sued." "Go ahead," I interrupted, lifting the tractor's bucket in the air just a fraction, the weight of the machine hanging over her like a silent threat. "But I'll tell you this, Marjorie. You can't stop me from standing my ground." She opened her mouth to argue, but I didn't wait. I started the engine, slowly turned the tractor around, and drove back home. I thought the noise of the tractor would be the last sound I heard that day, the rumble of the engine fading as I rolled back into my driveway, the heavy burden of the concrete barriers sitting like a victory. But the silence that followed was unsettling, more profound than I expected. I watched as Marjorie fumed at the clubhouse, her lips moving in angry bursts, but I didn't stick around to hear her threats. I had nothing left to prove. That night, my phone buzzed with a dozen notifications, text messages, emails, Facebook posts. A video from the morning had already surfaced online. Doug had posted it, as if he thought he were capturing a historic moment. In a way, he was. I sat down at my kitchen table, scrolling through the reactions. Some people cheered me on, others demanded answers. A few even tagged the local news station. Marjorie wasn't just mad, she was panicked. I could feel it in every line of her emails. "This is your last chance, Mr. Jensen. Remove the barriers, or we will take action. You have 48 hours. I chuckled. She had no idea how far I was willing to push this. The next day, I got a call from the city. A code enforcement officer wanted to visit. Apparently, the HOA had filed a formal complaint, claiming that I was obstructing the street with the barriers. Funny, since I wasn't the one who had put them there in the first place. I agreed to meet him, of course. Why not? The more eyes on this, the better. The city guy showed up that afternoon. Tall, gruff, with a clipboard and a knowing look in his eyes. The moment he saw the barriers in front of the HOA building, he raised an eyebrow. "Marjorie Pickens," he muttered, as if the name itself carried all the weight of the issue. He glanced at me, then back at the barriers. "You do realize that this is technically illegal, right?" "I don't know," I said, stepping back and gesturing to the perfectly paved street and pristine sidewalk. "Is it?" "Could be," he said. "If you're blocking access, there could be a citation." But he looked at the concrete slabs and sighed. "I think we both know this goes beyond some rules about parking." I wasn't looking for a free pass. I wanted the city to see what this HOA had done and how far they'd pushed. We walked down to the street together, where a handful of neighbors had gathered to watch the conversation unfold. The officer shook his head, muttering something about neighborhood drama. Marjorie had clearly been hoping for something different. Her car was parked across the street, but she had stayed inside. Maybe she thought I'd back down when the city showed up. Maybe she thought she'd win by wearing me down. She was wrong. When the officer left, I saw the first signs that the tide was turning. The neighborhood was no longer divided by quiet whispers and half-hearted complaints. People were rallying, calling out the HOA's abuse of power. My name was passed around like a flag, waved high and proud. By the end of the day, I'd gotten more messages. The HOA board had been forced to call an emergency meeting. The neighbors were organizing. The complaints about the barriers were piling up, not just from me, but from others who'd felt the cold grip of Marjorie's tyranny. Her reign had become a joke. I stood at the window that evening, looking out at the barriers, still stacked like blocks in front of the clubhouse, when I saw someone walking toward me, Doug, the neighbor from a few houses down. I stepped out to meet him. "I gotta hand it to you, Jensen," Doug said with a grin. "You're not messing around." He paused, his eyes flicking over to the barriers. "You know, I'm pretty sure Marjorie's got a few skeletons in her closet. Not sure the board even knows about all that." "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. Doug lowered his voice, glancing around. "Let's just say she's been using HOA funds for some personal expenses. Landscaping invoices that were never done. Consultants that don't exist." I frowned. "Are you serious?" "Oh, I've been tracking it for a while. Not enough to make a case, but enough to get people talking. Trust me, this isn't just about a few concrete blocks anymore. She's gonna crack." Doug gave me a half smile and turned to walk back to his house. "Good luck, man. I think you've got this." I stood there for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. I knew Marjorie was a piece of work, but this? If what Doug said was true, the whole neighborhood was sitting on a powder keg. And that powder keg had Marjorie's name on it. That night, I did what I should have done days ago. I sent a message to the local news station. I forwarded the video, the HOA's letters, the city's response. I included Doug's tip as a lead. Within hours, a reporter called back. I didn't know how far it would go, but I knew this was the beginning. I wasn't just fighting for my driveway anymore. I was fighting for the whole damn neighborhood. The game had changed. The next week felt like a pressure cooker, the heat slowly building with every call, every email, every whisper in the street. The HOA board was unraveling, but they weren't going to go down without a fight. Marjorie had summoned her allies, calling in favors from city officials and even hinting at legal action against me. But as the neighborhood buzzed with news of the corruption within the HOA, more people started coming forward. Doug wasn't the only one with skeletons to unearth. It all came to a head one fateful Tuesday evening when a news van pulled up to the entrance of the HOA clubhouse, its satellite dish rotating toward the sky. The reporter, Claire Winters, was already talking to a small group of residents who'd gathered to tell their stories of outrageous fines, arbitrary rule enforcement, and misused funds. Claire looked up from her notepad as I approached, her eyes narrowing in recognition. "You're the tractor guy, right?" she asked with a grin, as if she'd been expecting me all along. "That's me," I said, letting the tension slip from my shoulders. "And I've got a story for you." We walked past the barriers, which had remained untouched by Marjorie's threats, as if they were relics of a bygone era. No one had dared move them. They'd become a symbol now, a symbol of defiance against an overreaching authority. "I've been trying to figure out what this HOA has been up to," I began, my voice quiet but steady. "But it's not just about the tractor, or the barriers, or the fines. It's about the way they've controlled everyone, using petty rules to keep people in line. People are tired of it." Claire nodded, jotting down notes. "And you're the one who decided to put an end to it." "It wasn't just me," I replied. "This isn't about one person or one battle. It's about all of us who've been kept quiet for too long." That night, the story aired. The video of me driving the tractor past Marjorie's barricades was splashed across every news station, the soundtrack of its rumbling engine playing on repeat. The report on the HOA's corruption, tied to evidence of misappropriated funds and unreported fines, made headlines. The local government was forced to launch an investigation. But the most significant moment came when the HOA held their emergency meeting to address the fallout. Marjorie was still defiant, her voice shaky as she tried to hold onto what little power remained. But the board was in disarray. Lisa, the secretary, had already resigned after the news broke about the shady invoices. Doug's tip had hit its mark, and Sandra, the interim president, was standing behind a crowd of neighbors who had turned out to demand answers. I sat in the back of the room, watching as Marjorie's grip on the situation slipped away. Her voice cracked as she tried to speak over the murmurs of dissent that filled the room. There was no question about it anymore. She was finished. "You don't get it, do you?" Sandra finally said, her voice cutting through the tension. "This isn't just about a couple of fines or a few barriers. This is about trust. You've lost it." Marjorie looked like she was about to snap. "This is ridiculous. You're all falling for a stunt." But the truth had already settled in. The community had spoken. Residents who had once been too afraid to challenge the HOA now felt empowered. One by one, they stood up to speak, telling their own stories of unjust fines and forced compliance. Some recounted threats they'd received when they dared question the rules. It was like the dam had finally broken. By the end of the meeting, Marjorie had been voted out. The bylaws that had held everyone hostage for so long were put under review, and new leadership was elected, a leadership that understood community, not control. As I left the meeting, my phone buzzed with another message. "You did it, Jensen." It was from Claire. "The story's blowing up. People are calling for accountability, and the city council is pushing for reform. Looks like the HOA's reign is over." I sat back in my truck, taking a deep breath. It was done. It hadn't been easy, and it certainly hadn't been quiet, but the battle had been worth it. I looked back at the empty space in front of my house where the barriers had once stood, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The tractor had done its job. It had sent a message, loud and clear. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, I knew the neighborhood was about to change. No longer would fear rule the streets. The power was back where it belonged, in the hands of the people.